All right. Welcome to the Tripping Point podcast, where we talk to a leader who walks us through a train wreck they had a front row seat for. Not just a setback, not a learning moment. We're talking about real wreckage that likely cost a lot in money, people, time, and the advice that got pushed aside along the way. I am Josh France. I spent 25 years building companies and caused a few of these wrecks myself before I think I've learned how to avoid them. And today I'm really excited to have a true storyteller and somebody that has an amazing background. I'm going to let him tell you about that here in a second. But this is Dan Manning, and his brainchild is Build the Story. I'm going to let him introduce himself right now because I could not.
Awesome. So good to be here, Josh. I'm Dan Manning. I'm a storyteller. So I kind of come to this from a very roundabout sort of way. I was in the Air Force for 25 years. The first half of that time as a fighter pilot flying the A-10. The second half as a military diplomat. I was also a speechwriter during part of my time in the military as well. And then in 2019, I became an entrepreneur. Today, I work primarily with startups, helping them to build their business, to communicate with people, and to just be able to move ideas from their brain into someone else's. I made plenty of my share of mistakes along the way, and I'm glad to share any of those that helps anyone else.
That's fantastic. Yeah, really looking forward to it. Part of the homework our guests have is think about the story that you want to share, the wreckage. So let's just jump right in. And why don't you give us some detail on the story you've got to tell?
Yeah, so probably the one that went the worst was when I retired from the military and I had this big dream of being an entrepreneur. And I thought that things would go pretty smooth because I'm a smart person. I'm able to do a lot of things. We started trying to build an audience around my ideas, and I was using LinkedIn. That was my primary outreach tool that I was using there. But what I did was I posted about everything, all of my interest. So some days I would post about military topics. Some days I would post about international affairs, sometimes about mental health, sometimes about creativity, sometimes about critical thinking, sometimes just about whatever was on my mind that day. And I built a curriculum that people were attending, and I built a small following of people that really appreciated what I was doing, and they got value from the classes that I was teaching. But after a couple of years of doing that, my income wasn't increasing, my business wasn't growing. And what I finally realized was that by posting about all of these things, I was never putting myself into my audience's mind at a time that they actually needed me. And I came to realize that nobody has ever said, you know what I need? I need a Russian-speaking fighter pilot to come in and teach me how to think. And because I was sort of like all spread out and nobody could think of me at the time that they needed me, nobody ever thought of me. So about 3 years into doing that, I decided to focus on one thing in particular. That one thing became storytelling. And as soon as I started posting about storytelling, now people could see the times that they would need me. And I would post about how, some of the startup founders that I was working with, they would go to pitch their startup idea and all they had looking back at them were blank faces. And when I started talking about it in that way, the founders that I was actually trying to reach could imagine themselves in that same place. After just about 3 months of really focusing on that one thing, I was on a call with somebody and they said, "Oh, you're Dan, you're the storytelling guy." I'm like, yes, exactly. That's exactly how I want you to think of me. And then since then, I've done about 1,000 stories over the past 4 years for founders, for executives, for people on the TED stage. And that really allowed me to grow. Now, I didn't change myself in between there. What I did was change the way that I was talking with my audience and what I was communicating about myself. And now I'm actually in a place where I can do more of those things. We still end up working on creativity or working on critical thinking or working on ideas, but the pathway in had to be something that was much more direct and much more focused. And if I had done that from the beginning, I would have saved myself several years and many thousands of dollars in wasted effort.
I can only imagine. It's sort of the jack of all trades and master of none syndrome?
So I think it's more about how people are kind of cognitively lazy, right? When you meet someone, you put someone into this bucket in your brain. And if you can't put them into a bucket, then they just kind of like get spilled over on the other side. So by giving somebody this bucket of storytelling and to hear more precisely, like, here's the pain that I solve for people. right? I saw the pain of not being heard or not being understood or being forgotten. Now people can relate to feeling that pain. And if they associate me as being the person who helps them to relieve that pain, I'm the person they think of the next time that that pain is cropping up. Like, yeah, I know this guy on LinkedIn. He posts about this all the time. They reach out to me, and I'm able to have a conversation with them. And it's more about getting that mind share than it is about anything else.
That's really interesting. Tell me a little bit more about. I don't know how much you can share, but I mean, you mentioned speaking Russian. You mentioned Kazakhstan to me before. Can you give
Yeah,
us a little sneak peek into that
sure.
part of Dan Manning, the life of Dan Manning?
Sure. Yeah. So I spent, as I mentioned, about half of my career flying airplanes, right? So I flew A-10s, which is a single seat fighter aircraft. But eventually,
Warthog.
here, yeah. And I told tons of stories as a fighter pilot, but those stories only have to be 10% true. But eventually, you have to grow up, right? You've got to do something that is not just always flying airplanes. And I was always interested in international affairs. So I got a master's degree in international affairs and started working in that space. And I became a defense attache. So I was assigned to Kyrgyzstan, which is a small Central Asian country. I was working out of the U.S. Embassy there. At the time, we had a U.S. base that was helping to support the war in Afghanistan, mostly tankers, like air refueling aircraft would land and operate from there. We also had troops that were on their way into or out of Afghanistan that would transit there as well. So I learned Russian for that job. So I was there for 2 years working directly with the Kyrgyz. I was the senior US military representative to the Kyrgyz government for the time that I was there. And that was a crazy experience of doing lots of things. But then I eventually went back to the Pentagon. And then one of my last assignments in the military was working out of our combined air operations center in Qatar. And at the time, we were fighting the air war against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And I was responsible for sort of the day-to-day operations there. But I also was a target engagement authority. So I approved strikes on targets, and I ran the hotline with the Russians because there aren't too many Russian-speaking fighter pilots. So I ran the hotline with them. In the beginning, when I started, we had 2 scheduled calls per week, and sometimes we would make the calls just to ensure the phone line was still working. By the time that I left, we were talking 20 times a day because our forces were so close to each other. We had to have this really intense deconfliction to make sure we weren't attacking each other or running airplanes into each other while we were operating there.
That's a lot of responsibility.
It is. It is. There was a lot that pivoted on those decisions and the way that I negotiated with the Russians. And really, I learned so much about negotiation during that time because we had no ability to force the Russians to do anything, right? We needed to find this common ground where the things that we wanted to do, that I could find a way to intersect them with the things that they also wanted to do. And also to communicate with them very clearly, to never overpromise, to make sure that they saw me as an honest broker, which I was with them. If I could not do something, I would not do that thing. And also to never ask them to do something that I didn't believe that they could actually follow through on. That experience in those sometimes very high stakes environments taught me a ton about people and about negotiating. And it all goes still back to strategy as well.
All very applicable to the business world, which you may or may not have known at the time, I suppose, right? You're just doing your job, but you were getting some very high level training and quick decision making, certainly. At some point in there, you mentioned craziness, and I don't know if it was in the context of being the Warthog pilot or directing these airstrikes, but is there a crazy story that's related to any of that you can share that just pops in your mind like, yeah, this was nuts?
So probably the craziest story was there came a point when the Syrians had actually attacked their own people and used chemical weapons. It was a horrible attack that they did. And in the U.S., the president made the decision that we would strike the base where they launched those strikes from. So on the night that we were doing those strikes, we had coordinated where I would call the Russians and tell them a few hours prior to that strike that the strike was going to happen, so that they knew that we were not attacking Russian forces. We're telling them, stay away from the runway, stay away from the aircraft hangars. Don't be in those places because we are going to strike there. So that was approved like all the way up to the US government. So I call them, I tell them, here's what's about to happen. And the colonel on the other side said, all right, we'll call you back. About an hour and a half later, I get a call back, but it's from the Russian three-star who was in charge of all the forces in Syria. And obviously, he had had a few drinks before the call that he made to me. And he was insistent that we should be working together, that we shouldn't be bombing this place. And he's like, Manning, I know that you're a military man. I know you're doing what you are supposed to do, but we should be doing these other things. Like, yes, sir, I understand what you're saying. Let me go tell my leadership, pass your message along. And he's like, oh, but another thing. And then he just keeps going on. So for 45 minutes, like while there are missiles in the air, he's having this conversation with me and I can't get off the phone with him to go pass on the message that he's saying. And then it turns out that the Russian forces get injured, but that night ends and I go back to my room and it's on CNN, like the entire attack that we just did and that I was just a part of. And it was one of the most surreal moments in my military career and something I still think about to this day.
Is there any fallout from that whole thing? I mean, I suppose you had a little bit of leverage if he was slurring his speech at the time, but I mean, how did anybody come together after that and go, yeah, Russians aren't real happy with us because we called them, they called us, and we were still executing.
So there was not really any fallout. Like we weren't sure if there was going to be fallout after that, but there turned out not to be any. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is our weapons are incredibly precise. So we were not targeting areas where the Russians were. We told them, like, stay away from these areas, and they did. But two, it goes back to the relationship that I had with the Russians up until that point. Like I found this common ground, and primarily the common ground was that I was a military officer, a pilot, and the people I was communicating with were also senior military officers who were also pilots. Our nations had very diverging interests, but we could find this common space where we could still talk. I was honest with them. When we had a red line, I would make sure that they knew that, look, I am telling you, if you do this thing, then there will be serious repercussions. If you threaten our forces will shoot back, and they don't have to call and ask for permission to shoot back. They absolutely have the permission to do that. If you do this thing, you are putting your forces in danger. And by being very clear to them about what I could do and what actions would be and what the repercussions would be, they could trust my word. And because they could trust my word, it prevented us from having this fallout. And we were able to continue to conduct our operations and maintain the operational movement space that we needed to continue our mission there.
That's amazing. And thank you for your willingness to stick your neck out and do that job. I'm sure there is a fair amount of liability that came with it. No, that's a fantastic story. And yeah, it really is so applicable to business because none of the communication you were having or the audience you were communicating with was necessarily on your side. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. 100%. Absolutely. They had very different goals than we did.
And I imagine you even tried to communicate with, I'm going to call it the enemy, whoever that might be at the time. I mean, it could be parts of Syria, but other parts of Syria were there to help them, right? So
absolutely.
You had all of these different players with different roles, with different levels of potential for disruption or success. And somehow you've got to put all of this together into a win, 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 win. I guess there's one loser, right? That was ISIS. Maybe the different. ISIS is there. I'm not sure how often we've got somebody in the bullseye in business to try to, well, I mean, competitors, we're all trying to get market share in one way, shape, or form. So I suppose the competitor could be the enemy, although I don't like to see competitors that way. I see them as fellow evangelists most of the time, but yeah, that's a fantastic story. So, okay, let's rewind a little bit and go back to your strategy story. Can you recall the moment where you were just fed up, the worst of it, where you're like, Oh, Dan, I've gone down this road. I've tried to be everything to everyone, and this isn't working. What did it require mentally for you to say, okay, I'm going from advertising myself as all these things to really we're going to focus on this one thing?
So it was at the end of the year doing my taxes, right? And you add up all the numbers and it's a negative number. And I'm like, I think about all the time that I spent, all the effort that I put into things. There were things that I enjoyed doing, but I was working hard and nothing was moving. I would have been better off, like financially, not doing any of that stuff and just, continuing on with the other stuff that I was doing. I'm like, why would I keep doing something that is not working? But ultimately, it came down to a faulty assumption. And in fact, I would link the faulty assumption even to the work that I had done in Syria as well. And sort of one of the strategic errors that we were making there. And there's this close parallel to these faulty assumptions that undermine everything that we're trying to do.
It's really interesting. You had to, again, take the information in front of you. In this case, the information was pretty clear. It was red ink, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it actually cost you something. And there's a difference between investing in something and effort having zero effect, I suppose, right? Is the best way to
Absolutely.
put that. Was there anybody, an advisor, a mentor, a close confidant? Was there anybody telling Dan along the way, hey, this is not going to work, or maybe look at this a little harder, or anybody advising you along the way? And if so, what were they telling you in hindsight, right? You don't hear it sometimes when you're in the thick of it.
So, I mean, certainly, like I have my own voices and my own doubts, like saying it's not going to work. There's a quote from Colin Powell that says, "Don't take counsel from your fears or naysayers,"
Uh,
right? Because I was doing something that normal people don't do, right? I was teaching about creativity. I was teaching about critical thinking. I was helping people to change the way that they think so that they could get better results. And there's not typically somebody who does that. Like, who would you even Google for if you were trying to do that thing? And when I work with startups now, most of the startup founders that I'm working with are doing something that has not been done before, and that's where the possibility for success is. So, I mean, every day I would have a doubt that maybe this is crazy, maybe it's not going to work. And both of those things might be true, but you don't know until you actually go and do it. The trick is having not falling for this sunk cost fallacy, that just because you have spent a lot of time and a lot of energy doing this thing does not mean that you should continue doing that thing. You need these points where you have the opportunity to make a different decision. Typically, what I find is that people don't change as long as you have the option to continue doing what you've always done. But once that status quo is undeniably and irretrievably broken, that's the chance that you have to do something else. And after looking at all the time and effort and money that I had spent that year, and I would have been better off not doing any of it, that was the thing that caused me to say, well, I've got to do something different here.
I mean, there was a threshold, right? What I think I'm hearing is you started out and it was an okay strategy, or maybe it was flawed from the beginning. I don't know. I'd like to hear your opinion on that. I'm going to try all of these things, but at some point, doing all of those things was no longer a great strategy. And do you think that you could help people today looking at their strategy and being where you've been and say, here's the threshold, right? When this happens or doesn't happen, you need to start thinking differently. Do you think you have that skill now from what you've been through?
Uh, I would say it's less of a skill and more of a mindset, right? So, one of the things that I teach is that the entrepreneur's job is to learn as much as you can, as fast as you can, as cheaply as you can. And rather than structuring, I could have done all of those things and structured them as experiments. And with an experiment, I know, like, here's the thing that I want to learn. I believe this to be true. What experiment can I do to see whether that is true or not? And now I sort of time bound what I'm doing by the learning and by the experiment that I'm doing. But instead, I just kept doing all the things for a couple of years in a row. Certainly, I learned things along the way, but it wasn't structured. So I just kept spending money and time to do those things. when I work with founders now, I have even a class that I teach very specifically about running these experiments. What are the assumptions? I have a tool even that I use. What are the underlying, maybe even unstated assumptions that you have about your business, about your customer, about the product that you're going to build? Which of those, if that assumption is wrong, is most going to undermine what you're trying to do? And then once you find that, what experiment can we run to test that assumption? And if that assumption's false, well, now we got a bunch of other things we got to figure out. If it's true, then good. Now let's move to the next one and continue this experimentation so that we can learn without having to spend a ton of money and waste a lot of time to get that lesson.
That's just a great example of what we're trying to do with this podcast. So the tripping point, right, is where when you did it yourself, you came out with scars. And because you have those scars and you don't want other people to have those scars, you can take that experience now, go to these other people and say, hey, this is how I did this when I was in the same position you were in. And this is the thing I learned. This is the pain I experienced from doing it that way. Now I have a much more intentional way that I'd like to share with you that will help you get around that pain. Right? Summarize that.
100%. Absolutely. Right. When I'm teaching storytelling or I'm working with storytelling clients, I say that by sharing these stories, other people get to learn from your experience without having to suffer your pain. Right. And I can learn so much faster if I'm learning from what somebody else has done and a story that gives me sort of those pieces that I need. And I get to add that experience almost as if I had lived it myself, except I don't have to spend the money, the time, the effort, and suffer the pain to get that lesson.
I'm very lucky to have some folks on our team that are super intentional about setting up learning fast and putting time constraints on it. Are you familiar at all with the jobs to be done process?
I've read it. I'm not an expert in it at all, but I'm vaguely familiar with it. Yes.
Frankly, I mean, we've used it over and over and over again. I'm still definitely not an expert. I lean on my really smart team members to just tell me what to do next.
Good.
But it's exactly what you're talking about, which is what is the job you are trying to accomplish here? Let's go out and ask real questions, and not just any questions, questions that lead to testing your hypothesis on that job and determining whether or not there's something to run with there or not. If there isn't, what did you learn through those questions that your next hypothesis could be advised by, right? And it took a lot for me personally to learn that. When I start telling my wreckage stories, that will definitely be one where I went down, like you, a path despite what all of the data and the people around me were saying. But yes, intentionally testing with that time bound, hey, at this point, we're going to decide one way or another. And that decision hopefully is not all gut, although gut can be a part of it, right?
Sure.
But it is research backed. Yeah, that's an amazing way to put it. And I appreciate that. And the audience will too. Anything else you want to share? I don't know if I've ever heard of the country that you mentioned. I think I said Kazakhstan, and there's like something Kurd, but that country was completely different.
Yeah, so Kyrgyzstan is just south of Kazakhstan. So it's all there in the Fergana Valley. They're all sort of twisted together. But I will add one thing to what you said, right, about this idea of experimentation, right? So even when I'm teaching about strategy, and I've written a few articles about strategy, and I actually co-wrote one with Dr. Jeffrey Miser. And when he talks about strategy, he says that strategy is a theory of success, right? So a strategy is not just what I want to do, but it is what is the theory that I have if I do these things that is going to lead me to that. But even this idea of theory, by putting it into that framework, leads you to experiment, right? So what else would, if my theory is true, what else would be true? And if my theory is true, specifically the part that I go to is what are the capabilities that I need in order for me to execute this theory of success? So now I get focused rather on things to do. I'm focused on what are the capabilities that I need to build, because there's a good chance that my theory is wrong. And this is especially in business and especially as a startup. Most startups fail, but most startup founders don't, because they learn these skills, these
Yes.
capabilities that they then apply to the next one and to the next one, to the next one that eventually works. So having more of this focus on experimenting and building capabilities rather than just having a strategy that says we're going to do A, B, and C ultimately leads to this broader success and sort of this lifetime of entrepreneurship and continuous learning.
I love it. I couldn't add one bit more to that fantastic summary other than maybe scars make us better leaders. Because pain is pain, and we all want to avoid running into it more than once, right? Well, fantastic. Dan, I appreciate your time. I thought this would be great, and it absolutely did not disappoint. How do people get a hold of you if they're interested in how to build a story?
Yeah, so probably the easiest way is just on LinkedIn. Just search for Dan Manning Storyteller. You're going to find me there. And my DMs are always open and always glad to have a conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem.